Good afternoon, everyone. My guest today is President David Malpass. I'm sure you would have all liked to see him normally in person, but like for everybody else, we can do the best we can. And David was gracious to accept my invitation to do a video conference with us. I thought the best use of your time, David, would be for me to ask you a few questions, and then we can take it from there. So welcome, David.
Thank you, Inder, and thank you for inviting me back after. And the 1818 Society is an important group, and we value the connection with you. So I'll look forward to your questions. Fire away, and I may give some background in my answers, but let's just start right in. Thanks.
Thank you very much, David. So first of all, congratulations on having finished your first year successfully at the World Bank, at the helm of the World Bank. I had initially thought about starting with your reflection back on the year, but given the COVID crisis that you've been dealing with the last 9 months, I thought we'll start there. It's been quite impressive looking from the outside what the World Bank has done. I understand we are on track to lend $160 billion to over 100 countries. You have committed $15 billion, I understand, to vaccine purchase. Tell us about, David, how did it happen? What it took to make this happen?
Uh, Thanks, Inder. And let me correct, or let me state two statistics. The 160 billion is what we are hopeful of committing this year. So the lending, as you know better than I, the disbursement pattern will vary depending on the types of activities that we're doing. Some of it is actually going very quickly. We think as in the COVID emergency funds, as much as 40% has been committed and is in the disbursement process. So some of it has been fast acting. Also, IFC has done a great deal already of trade financing, which is almost a revolving credit, meaning they're repaid and use those funds to make new loans for trade finance. And so those portions, so there's a variety of disbursement patterns out of the various activity. So the way we did it, it's interesting, and I'm new to the bank, but in March, as the COVID crisis was becoming fully apparent, and even in February, so we were in the process of closing down the bank, but also wanting to have a very fast, broad response, and that meant the paperwork that goes with it. So Axel and Manuela and the group came up with the MPA idea, multi-phasic approach, which required lawyers to put it together, a lot of coordination with the board, but it created a fast-track process that the bank could use. And then at the same time, we were working on IFC, developing working capital lines and trade finance lines, which were a little bit different from their normal kind of operation and also could be done quickly. So those processes started up rapidly in March. At the same time, I wanted to focus on the debt crisis. This has been something, I worked in the U.S. government in the 1980s at a time of another debt crisis, the Latin debt crisis, and I'm very cognizant of the challenge that excessive debt plays for developing countries, and the importance of trying to resolve it sooner rather than later. There are a lot of parts of the process that want to delay the resolution. For example, the creditors can get paid. And so they have some interest in delaying these debt resolution processes. So with Kristalina, we announced our goal of having a moratorium on debt payments for the poorest countries, on debt service payments. So that occurred in March. So we had simultaneously kind of three very active processes going on of shutting down the bank, establishing a new MPA and an IFC process, a MIGA process, and then thirdly, the debt reduction process. Then the G20 endorsed that, so that was good, and we were we were happy with the immediacy of the debt reduction process. Then the COVID health emergency, by the end of May, we had 100 programs set up. So that's pretty remarkable for the normal pace of the bank, and it needed the board involved and all of the parts of the bank making contact with governments to say that we have funding available and here's the menu. So we wanted to do a menu that would help guide the countries toward things that they could buy rather quickly and in some kind of sizable mass. And then one final thing I'll say, Inder, then in April and May, we established a fourth and very important process, which was called by various names, but it was the approach process, which was looking beyond the health emergency, that initial MPA. What would the bank be doing over the next year? And so we made early on in April the commitment of $160 billion from the World Bank Group, and then another $80 billion from other MDBs. So the combined force of the MDBs would be $240 billion, and that came out in the middle of April. And that allowed the bank then to begin to state in what ways would the various resources of the bank be accessible for countries. That 160 billion includes mobilization, for example, from IFC. So we were able to get all of that started. One final point then that I'll mention is just in the annual meetings from last week, we had board approval and added the idea that vaccines and therapeutics for COVID could be purchased through that same MPA, the same multiphasic approach that was a fast track approach. And with the board authorized up to $12 billion of commitments of financing or funding through that process, half IDA and half IBRD.
Thank you very much. That's an impressive accomplishment by any stretch of the imagination. So thank you for the clarification. But first of all, let me also say I'm also a participant from the 1980s debt crisis. So I was delighted to see that you took the lead. Maybe that's a unique thing you brought to the bank, which has come very, very handy. So I congratulate you on focusing on that important issue in this crisis.
Thank you. You know, it was frustrating for, I think, the whole world, and especially for the people in the Latin countries. So the crisis began in 1982 with Mexico informing the U.S. Federal Reserve that it was unable to pay, and Paul Volcker stepped into it. And then I worked for James Baker at both the Treasury and then at the State Department, and the process was very engaged. The banking system was all engaged, but the result for the people in the countries was, I think, unacceptable from a global standards because it went on year after year after year and wasn't really resolved until I worked for a while for Nick Brady as the Brady Plan was launched. And so it took all the way until 1990 in order to have any process that was providing light at the end of the tunnel for the people. So I wanted in this current environment, I'm really quite focused on not having a repeat of that dragged out process. I used these words at the development committee on Friday, that we don't want to see a kick the can process over again, because it leaves the countries underwater and the people of the countries underwater, meaning in danger of extreme poverty for years and years, and we don't want that. So I said that loudly. I'm worried that all of the inertia in the system is to keep kicking the can. So I want to try to find a way to break out of that.
Wonderful, wonderful. So let me turn now to sometimes crises are a time for invention, for you invent new things. And looking back, obviously what you did is quite remarkable and very fast. Do you think there were things you did that the bank would bring into its normal operating practices to either be more efficient or more effective or speedier, whichever way you want to look at it?
You know, we will do a look back after, and I don't know yet my own view of should there be clear lessons. The reason for that is in this particular crisis, we could say from the beginning in March, you know, in the Latin crisis, it was very important to have a menu of options for the creditors. So I used the same, we wanted the same concept in different application, but a menu of options for the countries that would allow the bank to focus. I'm not sure that that applies very often. You know, if you say you want to tackle the education problem, it's not really a menu of options. It's different programs in different countries based on what their needs are and what their children, how do they interact with the children, and so I'm not sure that we have an invention as so much as we had a good, solid implementation of a goal. And so maybe that's a lesson that we can learn from the bank, that if we identify clearly what we're trying to do, and then we get everybody working in the same direction, we can do it quickly, which I hope is the case. You know, that gets us immediately into the country programs, which is something I think is very important. We've identified the problem of wanting to have lower carbon for their electricity production. So we can identify that, but actually implementing that and getting to it has proved very hard. Vested interests are obstructive in that regard, and so we have country after country where we, the bank, know what the appropriate goal is, and the country even agrees, but actually getting there seems very hard. So anyway, I think we'll keep trying to set goals and then implement them as quickly as we can.
Because one of the things which I think this also, some of our members have been commenting and reflecting, the bank always faces this issue of you try to be in the country's kitchen and try to be there, field presence, or do you keep a light footprint? I think that's an issue which is being talked about, and I kind of wonder whether a time might have come to, because on the one side, I think one of us wrote an article last issue said, field presence is a faith-based initiative.
I agree completely with that needing to be discussed. I don't know the exact answer. I can tell you what we're moving forward now with a Mexico program. I went and visited the new President Lopez Obrador a year ago in November, and we had a thorough, long conversation about where I wanted to hear his views on what the opportunities are in Mexico and share some of our perspective. For example, that clarity of moving forward from contracts that if you had uncertainty, it was going to make it very hard for new investment to come in. So that's a very general point, but then that allows you to think about what kind of program could you have. So in that range that you give of hands off, where the bank is generally supportive of the direction of the country, I would say we might identify Indonesia in that kind of context where there seems to be some stability there is stability in the government. They develop a plan. They begin to implement the plan. We can look at the plan, and then we find ways to support it. And so that's a little bit of a hands-off approach. We're currently trying to work with the South Africa government, where the bank has not been very engaged in recent years, in a lot of years. And so on that, we can suggest ideas on what we think might be useful areas for the government to work on, but it's a government that has its own set of plans, and so we're trying to find areas that we can be supportive of good ideas that the government has. So Inder, that issue that you raise of how much engagement should the bank have depends greatly country by country, and also capacity by capacity. Some countries really don't have as much ability to design a plan and then begin hiring the people or having the ministers that can execute the plan and then moving forward. Other ones have a full complement of talented people, and we can only hope to help them along.
So, David, let's now turn to your internal challenges in the bank. I think when I met you early on in your coming to the bank, you had identified two issues which were on your mind. One was debt transparency, and the other was development effectiveness, that you'd like to see more. I'm interested in your views on a year later, where you are on those things. Do you feel good about it, that what you've accomplished? Is it, where are you?
Yeah, well, those are two big and good topics, and I also you mentioned the organization and structure of the bank. One area that I'm happy with is we went through the realignment process, which has put resources closer to the clients, and there have been many additions both at the top and in the mid levels of the bank that I'm very happy with, and that have been critical in the success that we've had going forward. The people are working out well, and the team has been cohesive. So as we think about development effectiveness, this is a bank-wide effort. We need 2,000 people working on development effectiveness. So I'm happy with that. We have a very robust process going on in the country partnership frameworks, which are a document, and we're trying to make it shorter and shorter and more focused, a document of what the country wants to do and where that intersects with what the bank can do. And then there are meetings where people challenge each other and try to find the best approach. The same is going on in IFC, and the intersection between IFC and World Bank is very important in the process of trying to develop a stronger private sector in countries. You need to identify what some of the challenges are, work with the government on where there are opportunities to improve it. And then the IFC can ask the bank and work with the bank, which it does on a daily basis, to try to get the bank to push the same issues that IFC has identified. And so my sense is that process is going well for the bank. I have to say it's not going so well. The countries, we're facing the challenges. For example, in Africa, one of the things that's occurred over the years is the President for Life phenomenon. So it's hard for the bank to work when the constitutional processes are often pretty malleable in the countries. Another challenge is quite a few countries have the idea that what they need most is huge, big mega projects, and the bank should help them with those mega projects. And you look at the project, and people from around the bank look at it and say it wouldn't be a very good idea to do that project. So then that leaves the bank in a position of saying, well, we don't really love your project idea, but we have other ideas. And then those are routinely turned down by the governments because they say, no, we want to do our big project, and we will find someone in another institution or in another development agency who's happy to help us with our big mega project. So that gives you a flavor of the challenge there. With regard to debt transparency, we've made a lot of progress over the last year, and I mean, this is a hard one to describe, but let me give you some instances. One is just last week we published the new International Debt Statistics, IDS. It comes out of the DRS process, which is within DEC, to give you a lot of acronyms. So it's been around for 71 years, this report, but it had not until this year really described what the creditors were perceiving as the debt that was owed by the countries. And we now have, so we added this year, there's both information from the debtor's perspective, but also from the creditor's perspective. And prior to publishing it, we went to some of the creditors and asked them to verify or to validate the data that the debtors were providing. So you get quite a bit of transparency and improvement in the quality of the data through that process. So that was important. Another aspect was the website that was created as part of the DSSI, the Debt Suspension Initiative. The IMF and the G20 were kind of reluctant to really be to put a whole lot of information out. We fight that every day. The normal inertia of the system is to not make information available to the public, to keep it contained. That has some to do with these non-disclosure clauses, which unfortunately have crept into debt relationships, but it also is at the core of the institutions. They think of it as it's information that they got and they want to keep. And so the World Bank has taken a dramatically different orientation on that by putting the information on the website and making it available to the public for inspection. Another aspect, so a third aspect of transparency, is the actual contracts themselves. As Ecuador went through its restructuring process a month ago, the World Bank was able to really forcefully advocate for publication of contracts. This is such an important part of the relationship that debtor governments have with their people. What's been occurring is they enter into secret contracts with creditors, and that just isn't good for anyone. And so we were able to get the publication of some of the oil commitment contracts that Ecuador had, and that then allows lawyers to look at it, people to think about it, and also, very importantly, it improves the analysis of debt sustainability, which is at the core of the work of the IMF and the World Bank. Up until some of these disclosures, there would be debts that a country had that were non-disclosed and therefore not calculated within the sustainability analysis, so you weren't getting good information as far as that. I'll give you a fourth one that was a critical part of this, and that's one of the things that's happened in the reach for yield process, and the China being a new, very, very large official bilateral creditor, is the techniques that the creditors are using has changed. And so one of the things that had evolved in recent years was central bank loans to other central banks, but they were getting counted only as swaps, not as loans. So we were able to add those into the latest edition of the International Debt Statistics, which is a very, for some countries, these are giant amounts of money that were not being disclosed because they were called central bank, swap, when they had all of the other aspects of debt. They paid interest, they had a maturity, they had to be rolled over with conditions. They were heavily conditioned lending from one central bank to another. And so that now is being disclosed as debt. And that allows the people of the country to have a better understanding of what they're getting into and what their lifetime is going to be about, which is to repay those creditors that have been engaged.
Well, you are confirming what some of us have said. It's nice to have an economist at the head of the World Bank and a social scientist at the head of the IMF. So I think
that's good.
We welcome that initiative. I think this is welcome. To a different subject, the pandemic now and the raging wildfires in California and now Colorado once again have brought people's attention to the issue of climate change and pandemic management. Some people have asked whether the World Bank is doing enough. Can it not take a leadership role in these areas, particularly for its middle-income clients, countries which really are the sources of emitters and can contribute? So What would be your thinking going forward on these two important global issues? Do you have any thoughts? Do you think the World Bank can do more?
Yes, sure, certainly, and we're trying to. With regard to pandemic, I think it got a little off track with the Pandemic Emergency Fund facility, the PEF facility, which was put in place some years ago. And so it was the idea of, could there be insurance financing that anticipated a catastrophe? You know, there's been a lot of success in catastrophe preparation for hurricanes, because the amount of data that's available, the occurrence of current hurricanes is more frequent, and so there are some ways to ensure that risk, and I think those have been more successful. And we have the CAT DDO process at the World Bank, and we're in the process of expanding that, and that's been a successful effort. And I wanted to mention one thing the bank has tried to do is preparedness. So for countries that have repeated occurrences of a given crisis, it would be a good idea if there were preparations made, either in the for example, stockpiling of materials to respond to a crisis, or mitigation efforts and adaptation efforts that would prepare and reduce the severity of an impact from flooding, for example, or from forest fires, things like that. It has been a challenge for the bank because countries that are developing, and even advanced economies, they don't want to set aside money to prepare, and they don't want to do the work to prepare prior to the actual crisis. And so we have, I think we've been more effective in the crisis response windows, which are the bank's emergency responses when a crisis occurs. For example, in Lebanon, we were able to begin work immediately after the explosion, even though many of the bank's personnel were personally impacted. People, and the office was basically destroyed. People were able to start work even the next day, and then were instrumental. World Bank people were instrumental in the damage assessment, working with the United Nations and other international agencies, but creating the damage assessment that could then be used to try to channel aid and resources. So I think I've given you a little bit of an array, not very successful in some of the insurance aspects of pandemics, more successful in crisis response. So one of the things we're doing right now that I'll discuss is with regard to vaccines for COVID. Now we have authorization for funding. We want to start, and we have the paperwork available because of the MPA that I mentioned earlier. So we want people to start, and they have this week, with working directly with countries to assess their preparedness for applying a vaccine. If there were a vaccine available, what would you do with it? Do you have the distribution system, and do you have the capacity to actually make vaccinations? And the added value of that is, because there are vaccinations needed for many other programs, it will be useful work. Even if it takes a long time to come up with a COVID vaccine, the work on the healthcare system is in its nature preparedness for other types of calamities. So that's the pandemic side. I do want to say on the climate change side that I spoke at at meetings last week, several of them, on the bank's interaction. You know, the World Bank is by far the largest multilateral funder of climate and climate change activities. We have a very high target goal for the percentage of our commitments that have climate co-benefits. It's over 30%, and we're maintaining that goal. The bank is engaged in adaptation and mitigation efforts. Low carbon, as I mentioned, is an important part of the electricity generation project, or I'm sorry, I don't mean project, electricity generation projects around the world. and then the bank is also deeply engaged in biodiversity. And so one thing we've done that's important is the creation of umbrella trust funds, the pro-green and pro-blue trust funds that help with the green side and with the ocean side of the environment. I have conversations with the world leaders on the ways that the World Bank can support the country efforts on this. So a lot of our programs are country specific and can help the countries meet their national targets for what they're trying to do with regard to climate change. And a final point then is on China. We've had a evolution of the program and relationship with China that's been constructive over the last year, and so we're working closely with China on global public goods. And one particular area is marine plastics, where the way China's manufacturing has evolved and their agriculture has evolved in ways that are putting too much plastic into their rivers, and that flows into the oceans. And so we're working with them on projects that would change the incentive structure and the direction of that in China for benefit around the world. So in all of those areas, World Bank continuing to be a world leader, and as I mentioned, I think it gets underplayed a lot, but the bank being by far the largest funder of climate and climate change initiatives worldwide.
Okay, David, finally, our members welcome your initiative to create a task force on racism. Mm-hmm. I think that's an important issue. All of us have been shaken up by the events of the last few months, but we also know it's not an easy thing to solve. It's going to require some really deep thinking. I'm myself reading a very frightening book called The Caste, which I recommend to everybody, learning a lot on what racism is all about. Can you tell us what your thinking is? Where are you on this thinking, and what do you expect to see happen?
Well, I've said very loudly from the start that racism has no place at the World Bank, and we want to work with our clients and with our contractors on issues of racism. So that's one aspect. We need to have as clear and loud a policy as we can on that. And then what we've wanted to do and what we did from the beginning, or as the problem became more, there was more consciousness of the problem. We had town halls, and there was a lot of work both from the bank-wide perspective and then in individual vice presidencies and so on, to encourage people to speak up and speak out in terms of what they thought about it. One of the things on racism is it means different things to different people based on their own personal experiences. And so there was, I think, a very strong, good listening process that we undertook. Then the racism task force headed by Sandy Okura was important because it put together, she's been able to bring together, I think it's 54 people, but from around the bank. They've made their first set of recommendations to the bank management 2 weeks ago. We reviewed those, so the senior management of the bank looked at the recommendations, very warmly reviewed them and found them helpful and implementable. And so I'm announcing today, I think, we as a senior management group are announcing today the support for those recommendations and the beginning of the implementation process for those recommendations. That's a first set by this task force, and I'm optimistic and hopeful that there will be more recommendations as we go along that are constructive, that help us get at the problem. So above all, our goals and our approach to it is to listen to bank staff, to recognize that we have a very solid, firm goal, which is having no racism at the bank, and working with our clients and contractors in that same direction, and having high aspirations for being able to make progress on that, and then also having a recognition that there are going to be a lot of different answers for different different parts of the world in terms of what they speak up about, what matters a lot to them, and so we want to keep that listening process going. So, this is a very tough process. One thing that the World Bank brings is, because it's been around a long time and has been inherently a diverse organization that championed that diversity throughout, really, well, I don't know long-term history, but in the more recent history years, the bank has been one of the world's leading champions of diversity. That shows up in the makeup of all of our, from the senior management downward, of the bank being diverse in terms of gender, in terms of geographic location, and so that brings strength to the World Bank that I think is a valuable resource for the world. I was just on a call this morning. I'm going to try to think who it was. You end up with so many calls, right? So we were making the point that the Young Professionals Program can, as it adds diversity, as it maintains a very diverse outreach, that helps bring in talent to the bank and cultivates that talent to the bank. So that's one aspect of what we can do. And I'm trying personally to make sure that as we look at promotions, as we look at new people, we've been successful at really building up, for example, the component of the bank that is from Africa in the senior management ranks. Women, of course, make up really 50% of the bank's senior management, which has been great. I'm glad you mentioned Kristalina, social scientist, going to the IMF. She was originally trained as an economist, and I wasn't. So, but you're right in the way that our careers and our kind of way of thinking about problems. She's more of a social scientist, and I'm more of an economist, I suppose. But it's been very helpful for the IMF to be totally engaged in the effort of social advancement for its client states, for the countries that it's working with. And I think over time, she's just completed her first year, a very successful first year at the IMF. Over time, I think the IMF can be an increasingly positive force in the social fabric of the countries that it works in.
Well, Kristalina definitely had a good year, but so did you, David. Your rookie year is very successful. I don't know what you're going to do for Encore, but we wish you well and really appreciate your coming. Any last minute thoughts for our members that you would like to share?
For an Encore, I don't have the loftiest goals. I have very practical goals, which I want to see people in poorer countries do well. And I want to tally that success one by one. In other words, if we could have 10 poor countries do quite well over the next year, I think that would be good. If we could have 20, that would be stellar. And so I really want to keep our work effort focused on what the mission is, to have people in their countries do better. And the task is really hard because we saw the poverty numbers just out this year showing the backward movement in extreme poverty. And so we want to not only reverse that, but then make progress in the other direction. So that's my goal for the year.
Thank you very much, David. Again, appreciate your time and
Thanks,
all the best.
Inder.
And my best wishes for please stay well.
Thank you, Inder, and everybody. Bye.